Howdy all of you delicious people, I'm here today to review Power Rangers Super Samurai. It seems like there is an overwhelming enjoyment of Power Rangers Samurai for a lot of people. So ultimately I went into the very next season just kind of to accumulate 20 episodes into whatever this review will be. More than likely I might not get extremely specific on like every single villain that ended up being in a certain episode. More than likely, I'm not going to go into severe detail about a lot of stuff. It might just be like a culmination of a lot of things at some point. So, going into this sequeled season, reasonably, this show was called Power Rangers Samurai still. I think reasonably you had to throw in the word super in there just because reasonably people would just deem it so, and of course the very first episode of this season deems it so to be called Super Samurai. Reasonably within this show, the most thing that I would say is that there is still a visual masterpiece going on with kind of the evolution of Power Rangers being put together and visually marketed really well in this show, as far as getting us to have slight tweaks in wardrobes, slight tweaks in visuals, like to see like an entire huge conglomerate setup of all the Megazords all put all together in this thing is quite amazing. It's quite a sight to ultimately see the Megazord approach in this episode. Here's my thing though. This is where the butt comes in. Is just the fact that it's like, ooh yeah, visuals, cool, ooh ah, this is great. But reasonably, it just seems like a rush to get to the Megazord-like moments within this season. It seems very much that reasonably it seems like the episodes were something of a boatload of who cares within this season, which is kind of weird to me. Like, it seems that within a sequel season, you would think, like, man, the story should be really, like, really character driven and really, like, to the point of you, like, going, yeah, like it's so great that I've already invested in these characters from the previous season. Now going into this, I'm like, man, how am I going to get some really great, like even better story than the first time around? But instead, with this approach, basically you get entire episodes as some marketing ploy to sell some product to you that's going to be like, hey, we're going to spend an entire episode just dedicated to this one item that the Power Rangers have to try to forcibly unlock. Or you have Bulk and Spike episodes that have them very much trying to be much more part of this show than what I can really understand why. And there are also gimmick-like episodes. Like, if the gimmicks weren't real before, man, were they like thickly real in these episodes? And these episodes, the gimmicks of these things were the worst things that you could have possibly imagined for certain episodes. And then they would also double down on probably the worst episodes to make a sequel episode that ties into seemingly the worst episode that I've ever seen in my life. Now, making a sequel of said episode, and I'm just like, man, this thing is just so, like, man, where did the story go? Reasonably, we have two additional characters on two sides of not only the villains, but then the heroes. The heroes and villains have additional characters, and I just don't quite understand why they needed to be there, besides a marketing ploy to sell more stuff to people. Hey, here's another action figure. Here's another kind of different spin on Power Rangers, but when looking at it, there's a huge problem with this. Not the fact that it is what it I will really have to explain this, because there's a huge problem with the additional character on the hero side, but it has nothing to do with, well, it kind of technically does have to do with, like, how this person is played out, but it has nothing to do with who this person is, or, like, it just, like, there's a big problem with how this person is just there. And she's it's just it's just that they're just there. And why is this person just there? It makes no sense. So, like, what is this person there to do that is gonna, like, go, oh wow, yeah, this person desperately needed to be here, just to be taken away and what a interesting endeavor that we go through these episodes. Reasonably, yeah, gimmick episodes, and reasonably a lot of episodes where it doesn't feel at all like they're still kind of going with some of the same kind of jokes. It seems that there is Maya, who basically the repetitious joke is she still can't cook. You would have thought that at some point within this episode, or within the season, especially during the second season, how everybody hates her cooking. You would have thought that reasonably what would have ended up happening was that she would have ended up learned how to cook one meal, and ultimately that one meal would be like the turnaround thing toward, it's like, well, yeah, a lot of times she is awful cooking, but she cooks this one meal, and then everybody's just like, well, hey, yeah, if you're gonna cook that one meal, we'll be able to eat it, and this and that, and finally resolve this whole stupid thing about one of the Power Rangers not being able to cook very well, because I don't know, it just kind of like, it kind of becomes a goofy thing in this show. So Jaden, who was the kind of the front runner in Power Ranger Samurai, seems to be very much taking a back seat in this season for a bulk of this season. But eventually he does have a story arcing thing, because reasonably there's the story arc thing happening, but reasonably this story arc is not good enough. As well as every story in in this season is just not that good enough. Backpedaling, recycling, or just reasonably tossing things out there just to have it just be a marketing ploy to sell more stuff. It doesn't make any sense. To have dedicated episodes to additional products and stuff like that, because reasonably you could have splashes of stuff like that going on into the Power Ranger like thing. I understand like Power Rangers in general is a marketing ploy to sell products, but man, do they really put that to the forefront, especially in this season. It's like, yeah, we really gotta sell more of this stuff. Seems to be selling well, so let's sell even more. Like, let's push the product even more. So, if anything, if we had one good story in Power Rangers Samurai, we now have no good story and just a bunch of randomly scattered episodes that ultimately eventually come to have a story arc towards the end of it, but by then you really don't rationally care because ultimately there is just a couple episodes left and you're left with just either recycled stuff or yeah, it is what it is. So that's ultimately what I have to say about Power Ranger Super Samurai. Justifiably, the episodes are just, man, I want to go back to Power Ranger Samurai and have every episode just kind of dedicated to one ranger, and like looking at it, like watching this makes me like miss Power Ranger Samurai and wants to make me go back to it and rewatch it again and like remember those good times. Like this one was just like, this season was just like, whoa, what a step back, really telling us that like they obviously knew going into this that this was going to be their last Samurai season. So basically they're going into this knowing full well they're like, well, heck yeah, like basically we're just gonna make this a cash cow thing and kind of make it easier for the people being the Power Rangers, because man, were there so few actual fighting sequences going throughout 20 episodes. Very severely rare occasions do you actually see anybody fighting anybody. I think the Kevin and Mike episode is probably the only real episode that I could fully fledgedly see there really being some real action in an episode, because everything was in a rush to just get to that Megazord like moment. So let's ultimately break down Octoroo in this season. Good God, did he like start to get very annoying with his little catchphrase there? Man, if there were characters like Alpha that would ay his way to being annoying, or eventually you would probably get annoyed with Rita with her "I have a headache." Man, with Octoroo in this episode where, or in this season where he is just kind of consistently, repetitiously having his little throw in like saying, man, was that just Like, man, why? And this character, like, I would just ask, what is the point of this character? I didn't really quite understand this character. I didn't really understand why we had uh to yes. So, anyways, let's go into spoiler territory. Let's just go into that sweet, delicious spoiler territory, because at the end of the day, now I can finally say things. So, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this season. So, spoiler time now. So, in this season, we have a new character for the villain side called Serator. And ultimately this is a character that is very much kind of bleeding into Master uh Zendrek's territory, and just starting to do his own thing, or ultimately having his monsters come in and fight into the side of this villain of this story, and just really going like, well, hey, like, yeah, like, I'm gonna be the new bad in this villain in this show. But it seems like this character was just there to push the story of um Dayu and uh Decker's story again. Because reasonably, within this story, we have Dayu and we have Decker, who are still very much. Decker is still the guy that is otherwise looking for that duel, and basically he's looking at the Red Ranger, and basically he's looking at fighting this guy yet again. And here's the goofy thing that I will talk about once Decker fights Jaden. So, in this episode, Decker is fighting the wrong Red Ranger, because there's a new Red Ranger in town. But not only that, here's my hilarious thing that I found hilarious. So, let me get this straight. So, we have a morpher that can summon a horse. Let me say that again. We have a morpher that can summon a a horse. A horse. I am just godsmacked by this. So, bizarrely, we have Decker and we have Jaden fighting on top of horses for reasons I don't understand, just to escalate this thing. But reasonably, I was just like, a morpher that summons a horse, and I thought that was stupid. And ultimately, like, that horse part had a very, very quick episode to just continue to fight off of. So, let me get this straight. Let's go back, taper back into the early portion of this season. So, the very first, early editions of these episodes, are just to push a fact that they have this little black box that now is going to help the Rangers control all the Zords, whether all of the Power Rangers are there or not. So if the Gold Ranger is just going to go and fish uh, because he he's tired of being a Power Ranger, so he wants to go and just fish all the day long. Then he can go F off and fish all he wants, because ultimately the Power Rangers are able to control all the other Zords by a new black box that is additionally being added into this season. So if not all the people can do all of their time within being on the show, that is what this black box is for. I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, but I think it was also just kind of a ploy to, of course, just say that, like, well, not every Ranger is always going to be, like, in the Megazord all the time. So, yeah, that whole thing was just kind of like a bizarrish ploy to just tell us, like, that not everyone is going to be in the Megazord. And I just thought that was just, why have to do a specific episode to give us a specific prop to, and not only that, like, the Gold Ranger had to figure out how to, like, he had to take forever to get the right numbers to dial into this black box thing, because he's the only one who could crack it, evidently. All right, sure. So now we're going to push on to probably the worst episode that I've ever seen in a Power Rangers show, and I'm starting to see some pretty bad ones. Like, I started watching Zeo, and not to say that there's any bad episodes in that, but, like, there's some episodes here and there where I'm like, those are really goofy episodes. So here is the worst episode that I've ever seen in my life. So we have a monster that takes people and trades them into objects. Like, takes the spirit of people and puts them into objects. So, for example, I'm going to rip out the soul of Antonio and I'm going to put him into a fish, and ultimately there's a cat licking his lips looking at this fish that's Antonio, going, you know what? I want some of that. And that scares the crap out of Antonio, to where in the sequel episode, he is all of a sudden completely 100% afraid of fish because of the cat that was supposedly attacking him, or going to attack and eat him when he was a fish before. This has got to be the dumbest episode that follows the dumbest episode. It ends up that Bulk is like a pop can, and Spike is a newspaper, and so on and so forth. Every Power Ranger, as well as Bulk and Spike, are objects, and then eventually, at some point, the real scary part is when somebody has to go and clean up these objects. Oh no! What's gonna happen? We ultimately have a trading place scenario where the Power Ranger has to trade places with the villain, to where the Power Ranger can get the villain's powers to put the villain into a soccer ball, so that way they can play around with the villain. And yeah, it's just to ultimately get it to where, to figure out how to change these things into the right places back again. And I'm just like, God, this episode has got to be the worst episode. The trading episode is the worst episode that I think I've ever seen. this is the dumbest concept I've ever seen in an episode. I get it, they're trying to do something different, but this is the stupidest thing. This is the dumbest. And then the sequel episode, like I said, you have the Gold Ranger who is afraid of his own sword because it's a barracuda blade, and because ultimately every single thing that is reminding him of fish, he's deathly terrified of anything. And so you have Master G that ultimately, like, basically telling this kid to suck it up and then be a Power Ranger, and so he just does. At the very end of this episode, you have to where ultimately the Gold Ranger is so scared of using his barracuda blade that ultimately he doesn't want to be a Power Ranger this episode because he's just deathly afraid of anything fish related. And I'm just like, good God, this man, Antonio, what a piece of work this guy is. I never, like, in Power Ranger Samurai, I didn't like this guy. And in this episode, it really does not help things. Help me put things in his favor or perspective or whatever. And this episode was the sequel episode of a horrible episode was just, it was just awful. So, moving on. So, we forcibly have monsters being dipped in by Serrator, and so reasonably, these monsters are slowly but surely seeming to be a threat for the Power Rangers. We have an entire episode where Kevin and Mike are basically just glued via the hands together, and so now they have to, like, spend an entire episode trying to figure out how to do common everyday, like, things. And because both of their hands are both glued together, so not even to the point of them just having one hand glued together. Now both the hands are glued together. And so we even have bejokingly in this episode that both Mike and Kevin end up becoming dance partners because recently, like, that's the only way they're going to be able to move around. But eventually we get the strategy of having both Kevin and Mike eventually figuring out how to, in a very unique way, attack this monster. And it seemed, because all the other Power Rangers were just easily defeated, so it kind of left Mike and Kevin to forcibly come together. And so the Blue Ranger had to kind of take a step down because he's so much powerful than the Green Ranger. So he took a step down to ultimately just copy and follow whatever the Green Ranger was doing and make it so that he just copies him. So yeah, there's a quasi-interesting episode here because I like the whole, like, gluing thing. I think the villain's name is Exipus, but I could be wrong. But yeah, there are some visually interesting looking monsters in this season, and I guess that could be the positive. We have Serrator that is very much pushing to fix Decker's blade, and ultimately Serrator is also quasi getting Dayu to be kind of out to the forefront as well, but there is some master plan behind everything, and Serrator is trying to get Decker to ultimately destroy the planet by basically like ripping a hole in this world by using his blade that had to be reforged. So Decker this entire time is using a substitute blade to still try and attack the Power Rangers, but it's just to wait for his blade to get fixed, and then ultimately Serrator is consistently forcing Decker to take a whole rip of reality, and Decker ultimately doesn't go along with it. He ends up just slicing through Serrator, and basically after that he just kind of leaves to eventually fight the Red Ranger at some portion within this episode, or within the season, I should say. So we have the Master Xandred, who ultimately is seeing that there is a new villain in town, and ultimately he doesn't like how he's conniving against his own villains to the point where it seems that even the villains are kind of fighting villains in this episode or in this season. And so I'm like, man, like the villains are even fighting amongst themselves. So I'm like, what the heck is. I am so like, man, this is a very interesting approach because it has some different things, some different elements in it. It's like villains fighting amongst themselves. Like, so it's to the point where the Power Rangers are so good that the villains are even like fighting for control of things. And so I guess there could be some good moments there, but reasonably it's snuffed out by just poorly executed episodes overall. It gets to the point where there's some like weird, bizarrish, like big hole that ultimately Bulk and Spike have to plug because it's like there's this big hole that is really putting forth some real issues in this town. And so Bulk and Spike end up taking a giant ball of bubble gum and sealing this hole that I guess is just out there just hurting people. So they just take a huge ball of bubble gum and roll this thing over to plug this hole. And I'm just like, why do we always have to do these like why do we have to push forth this whole agenda of Bulk and Spike in this? Like there's another episode where like Bulk and Spike, like we have one episode where Spike is infatuated with the Pink Ranger, but then eventually he goes and he meets Maya, and ultimately Maya eventually drops her wallet in within like this mall, and so Spike is like, well, hey, I find Maya really attractive, so I'm gonna go out of my way to go to her address and give this back to her. It ends up backfiring on them because they end up like realizing, well, hey, like this is a samurai dojo. How about I be like a samurai master? Like, hey, maybe I'll learn and this and that. But the Yellow Ranger ends up putting a black wig on because I guess she needs to show that she's much more in control. and she's much more of an aggressive character, which ultimately makes me go, okay, an entire episode about making this Yellow Ranger an aggressive and or strong person, that goes bubkiss nowhere, and it's just a bottled episode that is just trying to put this character in a different light because she's, I guess, most of the time just a pushover. I'm sorry, I never really saw the Yellow Ranger as a relevant character, so I didn't really see her as anything. I never saw her as anything. They didn't give her enough time to have me marinate on her as well as any bulk of any number of any of these characters. They just seem too bland, or they just seem too like, who cares the bulk of the time, sadly enough. So going into this, we have less of Antonio, which is okay in my book because that guy was a little too much in Power Rangers Samurai. But yeah, so he ends up in one episode having to figure out, within that awful episode of him being afraid of a fish, he has to figure out how to turn on this, or have this lantern Zord be on this show now. And so ultimately he has to figure out how to let's just say turn on this lantern Zord. And then a lantern Zord ends up becoming a portion of this show, which I kind of thought was intriguing. So pushing on, we have in this season a Serrator villain who ultimately is having a master plan to eventually turn on a lot of his villains. Master Xandrax eventually goes to the surface for a very brief time because he ultimately can't really exist on this plane for very long. But he himself wants to fight because he desperately feels he needs to, because everybody else is just kind of doing bubkiss nothing or fighting against themselves. And so ultimately Xandrid is just going on there fighting, but he's cracking because you have a lot of these villains that seem to just can't last very long on the surface. There's like an entire episode where they have like mention about these waters, and that there's like an entire episode where you have it to where like the people take like a stick and put it into this like water juice like device or thing, and they juice device thing. There's this like pop looking water that has all these bubbles in it, and so they put a stick to this weird looking soda popish looking water that's orange or like a weird orangey red, and so they touch this thing and then the stick ends up lighting on fire, and it's all through CG, you can really tell. And looking at this, I'm like, okay. So there's an entire episode where there's like a floor of lava like episode where like you see the Power Rangers jumping around all of these like floor of lava-ish like water spots, and ultimately they try to morph and they can't morph because there's some bizarre barrier that's going on, that ultimately they have to floors lava their way to it and then slice it in half. And I'm just like, you know what? There's some interesting things here, but they don't use any of this to any real benefit to where any later on episode goes into, oh my god, like here's another barrier. Oh no, I can't morph here. Oh, here's more of this weird looking water stuff that I'm gonna have to floors lava my way. I don't know, just like there's so many weird things going on in here. But eventually we have Master Xandrax that is kind of swimming into this water, um, this weird looking water when he gets back to uh, his plane of existence. And I thought that was kind of intriguing, but to have this guy like take like a Lazarus pit like bath. If you don't know what the Lazarus pit is, that's a Ra's al Ghul reference from like the DC comic books things. You could probably look it up, Lazarus pit. You can understand like for that, and it ends up being like uh, a healing bath, or ultimately like a bringing person back to life kind of bath, and that's what like I'm trying to get to. So we end up having Serrator end up, as well as any other usual villain in the story, sliced in half by a Megazord. And basically, this character was trying to like tear this world in half, but ends up very much being torn in half himself. Kind of makes a joke about it until he dies. But so pushing us to the very much deep second half of this. So we get Jaden, who gets a Dear John letter from some like order of sorts that is for these Power Ranger samurai, telling him, hey, yeah, like here's your pink slip, buddy, because you're getting replaced. So Jaden is supposedly getting replaced by Lauren, his sister, because his sister had the real true fire element within her all along. Because in the previous episode, we know full well via showcasing that there is a specific monster that ends up emo hairing her way through here. Like, man, the hair design on this monster looked really cool, but I didn't really understand the like. I guess the point was of this character was just to showcase that this guy doesn't really have the fire element within him, and like, cause this monster was like a heat-seeking fire element like character, and I guess Jaden didn't have enough fire element within him to have it radar or register onto this monster. So we end up having the secret revealed that Jaden didn't really truly have the real fire element. He is just holding this torch out for someone else who really has the fire element of the Power Rangers, and that is actually Lauren. So when Lauren finally shows up and just jumps into a Megazord and starts fighting people via a Megazord, while everybody else doesn't really know what's going on, Lauren just shows up and she's like, well, hey, yeah, like, I'm the new Red Ranger, like, I'm here, but here's the biggest problem that I have with this character. Not that the fact that she is a female, it could have not mattered what person at all that this person was. It's just the fact that she's a Red Ranger. So this Red Ranger is not leading any lick of anybody anywhere. Basically, she's a person that is seemingly consistently just going off with another person or by herself and either training or kind of talking to people. But a lot of the time she is on her own, and all the other rangers are all looking like looking at her, watching her from afar, just going, if only we were that person that could just be collecting a check for just a couple days worth of work and then just like saying bon voyage. Because yeah, so Lauren is a Red Ranger temporarily, but she was actually the Red Ranger. She should have really been cementingly the Red Ranger. But bizarrely, she's like, well, hey, you know what? Like, I came in here and I really kicked a lot of butt. But you know what? I think Jaden is just a, a like a leader of this team because Lauren didn't give a crap about being a leader because she just did stuff on her own because she's just been on her own for a while. So, hey, we're just going to give the reins back to Jaden and have him be the real Red Ranger because that just makes a whole lot of sense. Not really. Because when looking at him, like, if you're going to have a new Red Ranger, have her be in here for the rest of the season. And plus, she only really had like 4 real episodes quasi to do any lick of anything. But I'm like, what a huge missed opportunity because I'm like, when you have a female Red Ranger, this is a one of a kind of like historical opportunity that you should really pounce on. Like you should have an entire season of a female Red Ranger, or overall, you should just have female Rangers that have unique colors that they don't get to be in every single time. Like, there's very rare that you see a female Blue Ranger. There's very rare that you ever see a female Green Ranger. Normally it's yellow and pink, and that's usually all that they get. That is basically all that they get. So when seeing a female Red Ranger, I'm like, man, this should have been a whole entire season of a female Red Ranger. And like looking at this, I was looking into the season going like, oh, hey, cool. This could be an exciting moment where we have a female Red Ranger in this episode or in this season. But when looking at it, I'm like, okay, when did this character premiere? I'm like, wait a minute. So she premieres in like the very much towards the end of this season, and it's only for a couple episodes. But her character doesn't get enough traction to be relevant into this season. And so it's just like, God, what a waste of time to build up a character that just throws the reins back to Jaden and then just bows out. I'm so baffled and confused by this, but it ends up being what it ends up being, I guess. So we have Jaden who is still fighting Derek, or yeah, I'm like, what is the name? What is the name of this character? Who is he? Who is the name? Decker. Oh my god, Decker. There we go. Some of the names are being very remiss on me. So Decker, not Derek. Decker. So we have this fight out yet again. It spills out to try to be different than the first fight, but it just comes off severely goofy. And basically, we have a ring of fire going on with Decker and Jaden. And here's the thing. When you have samurais who are supposed to be building things off of honor and this and that, so we have the Decker Jaden fight that keeps going on and on and on, and like Jaden is morphing into his Power Ranger samurai, basically telling us that even though he gave up the reins to Lauren, he's still a Power Ranger himself. He can still morph. So what's to what's to really just say that, like, Jaden is just not gonna just go, like, you know what, like, Lauren, like, you know what, I've just been here for so long that I think, like, I'm not just gonna give this up to you. Like, you know what, it's great that you want to just step in here, but you know what, no. Like, I'm just not, I'm just gonna say, you know what, I can still morph. So, Lauren, whatever you're doing is bug kiss. Because I can still morph. But anyway, so we have it to where Decker and Jaden are fighting it out, and this fight ends up getting resolved in the most dumbest way possible. So we have it to where ultimately, again, what bugs me is Jaden summoning a horse with his morpher, but that's not all. So we have Jaden and Decker fighting in a ring of fire, and we have it to where Decker ends up getting clocked in the back by the Blue Ranger and ends up getting killed by via some backhanded like maneuver that Kevin ends up doing, and I'm like, what the I'm like, so you kill Decker in the very much most unclimactic way possible. And I'm like, wait a minute, so you're killing him via some stabbing in the back like thing, and ultimately just to push Jaden to be rescued by the rest of his rangers. And here's the thing, like, there was so much talk about honor and that this was Jaden's fight, just for it to not be Jaden's fight, and for Decker to get like sucker punched in the back, basically. What kind of garbage is this? Really? And so after Decker dies, Dayu is just kind of like, well, like, what is the purpose of me being here? The only purpose of me being here is to consistently lullaby Master Xandrax, who ultimately is consistently needing a lullaby that he wasn't getting because Dayu doesn't want to do any lullabies anymore, because ultimately her instrument is broken, and so she just like goes, okay, well, I'm peacing out, I'm leaving, because ultimately her instrument is broken. But not only that, Decker's sword was broken, and eventually he gets it re-welded and refixed, and then ultimately gets suckered in the back. So ultimately we have it to where Master Xandrax is going on to the surface yet again and is with Dayu. And what ends up happening is that Dayu ends up getting consumed inside Master Xandrax, so that way he can be on Earth a lot more, because Dayu had some human element that Xandrax just consumed. And so now the big battle is Xandrax and him being on this earthly plane now and not slowly but surely cracking away. There was also, speaking of cracking, there was a whole entire episode where you have this like armored, like shell like character that ultimately, like, the Power Rangers had to figure out how to like use these specific combos to take this thing down. And I just thought that was just like, that was kind of interesting. That was like interesting in the form of just have a strategy to take a thing down. But anything other than that, I was just kind of like, okay, shouldn't the villain eventually know that these characters are going to be attacking the same way every single time? And so the villain should be able to adjust, but instead he doesn't. And so the heroes just end up winning the day just because they just outsmart this character and does these combos to beat this character. Anyways, so Xandrax is back in town, and so basically it ends up kind of just going down into basically just another villain-ish like fight. They're consistently being like surprised on how powerful Xandrax is, but it doesn't really seem like they're going to be losing any real much of anything. And so eventually they just kind of Zord cut this guy away and kill him off, and huzzah everybody, like everybody have a party just because of how really successful they are. So yeah, like I think the very last episode was one that I don't know, I had problems just really sitting through it. I had so many problems sitting through it. Like, I don't know, every time like I was watching the very last episode, like I was honestly like dozing off while watching it just because it was just like these episodes were just really difficult to watch overall. Like they really didn't have like anything all well going great for them. And basically everything was just like a paint by numbers kind of journey through a lot of this. It was just like, oh, okay, well, this is the gimmick that they bizarrely are putting into here. Okay, well, okay, so now whoever one or two people are left are gonna have to figure out how to work together and beat this thing. And surefire enough, they eventually do. Because I thought the most interesting thing that was going on into this thing was that whatever the monster's gimmick was would be ultimately negated by the Power Rangers ending up killing this monster as quickly as humanly possible. Like there was one villain that was making people sick by attacking them with like some kind of weird like sand or bug device. There was the one episode where everybody was crazily eating, and like I thought that episode was extremely goofy and or stupid. There's one episode where everybody was getting really sick because of there was some character that was tossing bugs to people, and so Bulk and Spike were going into some like porta potty ash like thing or some camera um like little hideaway, and Spike desperately realized that when his tummy was grumbling that he needed to eat something, and so Bulk and Skull had to pick up this porta potty ash like device thing and pull it to where there was food nearby. So yeah, it's just some weird episodes, some very odd approaches, and recently there was nothing besides it being visually interesting to watch at some points, but I don't think that I'm ever really gonna go into this season again and ever like rewatch any episode. I'm not gonna like hold anything near and dear to me because I felt like a lot of this was just either a marketing ploy or just something to buy time for this Power Rangers company overall to just go, okay, well, hey, like we're wrapping this season up, we're driving it into the ground to wrap this up. so that way we can go on to the next season, because that's all that they care about is like, oh, okay, what are we doing next? So yeah, speaking of which, I'm gonna get out of here because I've been talking for an hour about this. Hopefully, people maybe liked my opinions about this episode. Hopefully, they didn't dislike any of my opinions, but I'm just being brutally honest about this season, being brutally honest about some of the stuff that goes on here. So I'm gonna get on with doing other things and say goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.